Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
To all who shall see these presents, greetings. On behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the BruteCast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Nate Janikin, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. We will also be recording this webcast for the benefit of those in our community of interest who could not join us today, so we ask that you keep your own webcams off to help us stream smoothly. At the conclusion of our discussion, we'll have a question and answer session, so if you have a question, just type it into the group chat and I'll go through them in the order received. The Russian people went to the polls from the 15th to the 17th of this month in order to cast their vote for the country's next president. With results that likely surprised no one, Vladimir Putin was elected to his 5th term as the Russian president, and this is only the 8th since the formation of the Russian Federation. With that, I'd like to welcome back Dr. Victoria Clement, who is our Russian subject matter expert here at the Krulak Center, and I feel like we should just get right into it. So Dr. Clement, I'll turn it over to you, and if you're ready, I can start sharing the slides as well.
Yes, that would be fine. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Okay. So let me start by saying a few words. So it was March 15th through 17th that there was a so-called election for president in Russia. In fact, it was less of an election, meaning there was no real choice, than it was a pro-Putin event. So Putin was all but guaranteed to secure his 5th presidential term in the event. And since he faced no real opposition on the ballot, it was, as was mentioned, it was didn't surprise anyone. The results didn't surprise anyone. The result was that he purportedly won 87.2% of the vote with a 77% turnout. But as I said, this wasn't a real election. One analyst wrote that it represented, quote, a mobilization and legitimization ritual in which the results were preordained. And Russians were tongue-in-cheek referring to this as the special electoral event or the special electoral operation, kind of a play off of the special military operation in Ukraine that the Kremlin requires people to describe the war in Ukraine as. So as you may know, the Kremlin will not allow anyone inside Russia to use the word war or aggression or invasion. They instead paint the Russian incursion into Ukraine as a defensive undertaking. That war, which is what it needs to be called, has continued since the full-scale invasion of February 2022, but it really began in 2014 with the seizure of Crimea, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we get through some of these slides. So just as we have a war that cannot be named a war, we have had an event that should not be called an election. It was an orchestrated event. So in this event, Putin felt the need to demonstrate record results and gain more than 80% of the vote. During the previous vote in 2018, Putin officially received 77% of the vote. He exceeded that this time, reaching just over 87%. But the final figure by which he is officially purported to have been reaffirmed has, I think, little to do with probably the number of people who actually voted for him, because there were stories of ballot stuffing. There were stories of people being coerced into voting electronically in the workplace. There were stories in some of the Russian-held areas of eastern Ukraine of people being forced to vote at gunpoint. So the question is, I think, if the results were predetermined, why hold this? Why go through the motions? Why even bother with the pageantry? And I think the answer is simple. It was a ritual. It was an opportunity to show that everyone is on the same page with a large turnout and a solid sweep for Putin. And the bottom line is that while he's an autocrat, an authoritarian leader, he still craves a show of mandate. And it was a confidence builder for Putin. And it will allow him to say to his international counterparts, the people are still with me. I'm the elected leader. I have the mandate. So having said that, just as some preliminary remarks, let's go through some slides and I'll talk about the mechanics of the event and the consequences that I see. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is a typical election billboard, poster signage. And it says at the top, just election for the president of Russia with the dates. And below in the middle, it says, together we are strong, vote for Russia. And this, on the face of it, this is a pretty innocuous signage, but the words in the middle, "Вместе мы сила," together we are stronger, is a phrase that Putin uses all the time. So I think that by using his verbiage, we have kind of an implicit or maybe even subliminal messaging going on here in support of him for the vote. And I think that through that messaging, the idea is that a vote for Putin is a vote for Russia. A vote for Russia is a vote for Putin. And we saw headlines right after the election event. Results were released. Newspaper headlines that read, "Russia is Putin, total victory." So the message, again, it's that there is no alternative to Putin and none is needed. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. So this is just a typical ballot collection box. I just thought I would give you a picture of, show you a picture of what how they're collecting the votes. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, this is Putin's own personal, his campaign's signage, and it just says Russia, Putin 2024 presidential election. And this is in Mariupol, which is it's noteworthy because this is in a city that you've probably heard about in eastern Ukraine, where there was an enormous amount of fighting, where the Ukrainians really tried to hold their ground, and Russia has control currently. So this is one of the areas in eastern Ukraine where they were forced to vote. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Here we have the ballot. So this is the ballot that people had to check off, and it's pretty straightforward. It's a paper ballot, unless you vote electronically, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But this is what it basically looks like. You can check one box, and I'll just tell you just a little bit about the candidates. So I'm going to start with Kharitonov, who's the communist. The older party, and I should say all four of these candidates were what you would call the usual suspects. So the three opponents, Putin's three opponents, were not a surprise. They are members of the government. They are loyal to the system. They're somewhat known at least within their circles, they're known, but they are not, big, famous, charismatic personalities. So very much in contrast to Putin in that respect. But okay, starting with Kharitonov, Nikolai Kharitonov was the communist candidate, and he got 4.3% of the vote. That's actually not up to what the communists usually garner. They usually garner maybe 10 to, I've heard 17% of a vote in various elections. So they did, the official results show that they did less than were expected. The next one is Leonid Slutsky. He's from the Liberal Democratic Party, which is a party that is neither liberal or democratic. It's a nationalist party. Some of you may recognize the names Zhirinovsky, who was the leader of the party until his death a few years ago. Currently, this Leonid Slutsky is the leader of the party. He received 3.2% of the vote. And then finally, we have Vladislav Davankov, who is a member of the New People's Party, which is the newest party and is considered to be it's being called a liberal alternative. I mean, it's sort of liberal, I guess, in Russian terms, but it stands for things like economic modernization, and he took the position. This candidate took the position of pro-peace. He initially, did not. He's not an anti-war candidate, but he was a pro-peace candidate. So he wasn't fully supporting the war in Ukraine. And it's probably, he also was somewhat supporting Nadezhdin, a person I'll speak about in a minute, probably to get his supporters when he was disqualified from the running. And I'll talk about Nadezhdin in just a minute, but let's go to the next slide, please. So this is, I know it's a little bit tough to see all the numbers because of the way the picture is taken. But what's significant here, these are the results with the 4 candidates. You can see that Putin's resulting official tally. And it's important that each of the 3 opposing candidates got at least 3% of the vote, because by reaching that 3% mark, they get federal funds for their party. So that each vote that they receive gets a certain amount of funding. And they each did reach that 3% vote, that 3% tally. The other thing is that it doesn't look good if Putin doesn't have candidates to run against, even though he's the only one that's depicted as very capable and smart and the obvious choice. But as one analyst said, Putin needs backup dancers. So he needs candidates to run against, and that's what they supplied. Let's go to the next slide, please. And this is just a very basic picture of the ballot counting. So just to show you, you can see the ballots somebody has checked off, one of their candidates, and they slowly count them by hand, unless they're electronic, which again, I'll talk about in a minute. But let's go to the next slide, please. And I'll talk about Boris Nadezhdin. I said I would explain what I meant about support for Nadezhdin from Davankov. So Boris Nadezhdin was a citizen of Russia who is against the war in Ukraine. So he took an anti-war stance, and he collected the requisite number of signatures to become a candidate on the ballot, but some of those signatures were disqualified. So he did not get accepted by the election committee as a candidate. Let's go to the next slide. I'll keep talking about this, but I want to show you, these are the collected signatures that Nadezhdin had accumulated. And the basic fear among the leadership, the government leadership, was that Nadezhdin would make 10% of the vote. So, and I'll show you some graphs in just a second that demonstrates that. But what Nadezhdin said, which I think sums it up, is that if he had been allowed to run, and if he had garnered 10% of the vote, it would show something is wrong with the system. So he collected the signatures, they were disqualified, and he was not allowed to run. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is just a photo of the people who were lining up to sign his candidacy papers so that he could get his name on the ballot. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the result of a survey that was taken in late January, and the results show that Nadezhdin was going to garner approximately 7.8% of the vote. Now, Vladimir Putin would have exceeded 62%, so it still would have been a landslide, and the others would have gotten some small amount. But that 7.8% was not a secret. And so it was starting to make the government leadership, very nervous. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this is, I know it's in Russian, but this is just the results of another poll taken not around the same time. And it shows that while Vladimir Putin would have received 79% of the votes, even higher amount, Nadezhdin would have gotten over 10%. So this fear that he was going to get a certain percent of the vote was founded in polls that were taken, popular polls that were taken by various groups. So this just made the government leadership very uneasy. And that is, we believe, why he was disqualified. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Now, this is Ekaterina Dontsova. She also tried to run. She didn't even get past the point of, she didn't even get to the point of collecting signatures. She was disqualified from running pretty early on. She was also an anti-war candidate. We believe that that is why she was disqualified. And I want to underscore that I'm showing her picture and talking about Nadezhdin so much to underscore that there are people in Russia who are against the war, who did not want to support Putin with their vote, and are maybe quietly in opposition to some of the policies of the current government. Okay, let's have the next slide, please. Now, the most famous person who probably would have been on the ballot if he could have been is Alexei Navalny, who, as you all know, died in prison in February. He did run for mayor in 2013, and he garnered a fair amount of the vote, more than a quarter of the vote, but wasn't allowed to run in the last presidential election in 2018. As you probably well know, he was poisoned with Novichok in 2020 and was out of the country, but returned to Russia in 2021 and was imprisoned from then until his death. Let's go to the next slide and I'll talk about the stance that he took. Oh, this is some graffiti, artistic graffiti, but this is the kind of sort of quiet opposition to government positions that I think we see, you know, this kind of art, which is being covered up in the wake of his death. Next slide, please. These are people at his funeral. So it was, you had thousands of people come out for his funeral at a risk to themselves. You had people laying flowers at his grave, and some were detained. But it was quite a showing of support for Navalny as a person and for his ideas. Next slide, please. The widow of Alexei Navalny, Yulia Navalnaya, has taken up the mantle and has started to carry on his legacy. And one of the areas where she's working, or she was visible in this last event with the voting, is something called smart voting. So go ahead and go to the next slide, please, and I'll tell you about smart voting and why. What Alexei Navalny started in 2018 was still relevant for this last event. So this is a poster that says "Umnoye голосование," smart voting. And this is a phrase, this is a sentence, a couple of sentences that Navalny said in 2018. The idea behind this was, don't boycott an election. Show up in force, but vote for someone other than Putin. So United Russia is Putin's old party. He ran as an independent in this vote, but Navalny was really pushing against the United Russia party when he said this in 2018. So vote for anyone other than Putin and just, you know, throw a wrench into their works. That's the idea of smart voting. Let's go to the next slide, which relates to this. And you'll see that people who supported smart voting in a very public way like this man who is holding a sign that says Umnoye Golosovanye, were detained or arrested. So it's very much a protest vote. Let's go to the next slide, please. So we know that there are people who do not support Putin or the war. Unfortunately, and then many who didn't support this so-called election process, but many of them have had to leave the country because of the strict circumstances in the country, where the restrictions on speech, the restrictions on assembly, and we saw more people protesting at election sites outside of Russia even than we did inside of Russia, because so many people who have left the country were gathering and taking part in the smart voting. Next slide, please. But there were people inside Russia who did attempt to sabotage things. And so what we have here is a picture of a woman who's pouring green dye into one of the ballot collection sites. And we saw this around the country. I think there were between 40 and 50 recorded or publicly discussed events where or occurrences of people trying to sabotage the voting sites. They either would pour the green dye in, or some people threw Molotov cocktails, sometimes successfully, sometimes not successfully, to burn down polling stations. Next slide, please. This is a flyer that was circulating in recent months and it says, "We are path. We are not Putin's path," because it implies the quiet way that people are rebelling. So let's go to the next slide, and then I think the question is, if there are so many people who were against this, and it was such a sham, how did the regime get people to come out? Well, on one hand, there was the incentive to participate in smart voting, but the government, the leadership in the Kremlin also wanted a lot of people to come out, as I was saying earlier, just to get this, just to get the big numbers for Putin. And the way they increased the chances of that was, one, they made it 3 days of voting, so not just 1, but 3. And that's something that they started during the pandemic for practical reasons, but they've maintained to keep numbers up. And the second thing they did was to start the electronic voting. So I mentioned that, I said I would talk about that. This is a picture here of Putin voting online. So it was the first time that electronic voting was used, and that really increased the number of people who participated, and it made the results easier to manipulate. So there were a lot of cases of people who were encouraged to vote at the workplace, where their supervisors kind of stood over their shoulder and hovered and pressured them to vote for Putin. Let's go to the next slide. This will show another way that they were working to get people out to the polls. They were giving away prizes. So this is a poster, and it simply says the dates, and it says, "Come to the polling station, take a photo, participate in the competition, win prizes." And the idea was that if you would take a photograph of yourself or your family, even better, at the polling site, with some identifiable background, then you would upload it to one of the websites. You would be in the competition for a prize. So they were giving away everything from free lunches to concert tickets to hair dryers to a new car. Let's go to the next slide, and you'll see a picture of a woman who was taking her photo. And this just says, "Our family goes to the polls." So those of you who have heard me speak before have heard me talk about the emphasis that the Russian government places on traditional family values, traditional national values, and the family is one of those important pillars to those values. And so they really kind of brought that into the discourse of the voting. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, this is a very similar poster, and it says, "Our family goes to the polls," and but it is targeted toward an ethnic minority in Russia. It's for the it was a poster that was put up in the Tatar region of the Tatar Republic, which is the Tatars are a Turkic majority Muslim Turkic language speaking group that live in south of Moscow. I'll show you on the map in just a second. They were encouraged to come out and vote, specifically in their region. And in addition to this, the prizes and this big encouragement to come out, the authorities put on a lot of events like concerts, and they had family events out on these days. So this one says win valuable prizes for photos with your family, just like the other. But there were also a lot of fun events to come and bring your family to. Let's go to the next slide, please. This will show you where the Tatars live in Russia. It's a map. Just to orient you a little bit. So you see where Moscow is in the north, and then the Republic of Tatarstan the capital is Kazan. And there were posters like this around the country, geared toward various groups. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so in addition to the smart voting, there was a Noon Against Putin campaign, which was a protest that was planned for polling stations all across the country by the supporters and allies of Alexei Navalny. So the person who really coined this phrase and came up with the initial idea was Maxim Reznik, who you see pictured here. And the idea was that they called for people to come out at midday on March 17th. So they wanted as many people as possible to come out on that day. This is the opposition. They wanted as many people to come out that day at the same time to show support for peace and in opposition to Putin and his policies. And the idea was that you would see your neighbors, you would see your friends, you would see your colleagues who maybe you didn't know were anti-war, or you didn't know were not big supporters of Putin, but you would see them in this at noon at the polling site, and it would build a sense of community and a sense of belonging, a pro-peace community. Let's go to the next slide, and I'll just show a picture of the lines. So it worked. Noon Against Putin was pretty successful, especially considering the circumstances within the country. We saw thousands of people come out at that time on that day. And it's worth underscoring that this demonstration, Noon Against Putin, was the third recent sign of significant Russian protest or political dissent along through lines. So first was in January, you had the lines where people stood in line to sign Nadezhdin's paperwork to put him on the ballot. Second, you had the long lines. You had thousands of people standing in line at Alexei Navalny's funeral, and then for days afterward to lay flowers and letters at his grave. And then you had this event. So people have been putting themselves out there and coming out. And I think that it's worth noting that we have to say that although this involved thousands of people and it was important, the protests were largely symbolic and they weren't sustained. Meaning, what I mean by that is that they were meaningful to the individuals who participated and for the people who saw them. And so there may be long-term consequences on local levels, but we don't see, but it was a limited event. It was a limited action. So it wasn't sustained, and it wasn't really sustainable. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is a picture of Putin's acceptance speech rally. So we've got here are people who were given free tickets to come in and fly flags and support the acceptance speech of Putin after the election results were made public. And the signs up there say Russia. On the left, you have the word Crimea. On the right, you have Sevastopol, which is the city in Crimea, the port city that houses the Black Sea Fleet. And in the center, it says 10 years of homeland harbor. So it's referencing the fact that it's been 10 years since Russia took the Crimea Peninsula. So when we first started, I mentioned that this has not been just a 2-year war. This has been a 10-year war. And it started with the seizure of Crimea in 2014. And this is something that Moscow not only doesn't deny, but is clearly very proud of. Let's go to the next slide, please. These are the candidates who ran against Putin, who stood with him on the stage and said really nice things about him and made speeches to show that they are going to support him and they are loyal allies. So let's go to the next slide. Got a map here of Ukraine. So this is where the current fighting is taking place, and shows the area that Russia has basic control over. And I put this up here to remind you that we're talking about largely these 4 districts in eastern Ukraine, 4 oblasts: Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. And then there's Crimea, which you see at the peninsula in the Black Sea. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is a sign that was up the day of the election, and what it says is night of the election 2024 for a Russia without borders. I think, and I wanted to show you the map of where Russia is controlling eastern Ukraine, and this sign just to underscore the sentiment that's being expressed by the Kremlin that Russia doesn't have borders. Let's go to the next slide, please. Similar sentiment being expressed in an electronic billboard. It says, "The borders of Russia end nowhere." So I just think this is very powerful messaging for the expressing the sentiment that the Kremlin feels that there are no limits for them. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is part of the real campaign that the leadership is really putting its weight behind. This is for the war and recruitment. So this is a recruitment poster, and it says, "Service to Russia is real work." That's the real work. So they're looking to increase the numbers of people joining up. And this is what is really concerning the Kremlin right now. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is a little bit old, a little bit dated picture, but it gets the message across, which is that if you join up, you get a really good salary. So this is how they're getting people to join if they're joining voluntarily, which not everybody is. $7,000 one-time signing bonus and a $2,000 200,000 ruble, which is about $2,000 monthly salary. And since the average salary in Russia is about $500 a month, that's a pretty good salary, pretty good take-home money. So this is how they're encouraging people to sign up. Let's go to the next slide, please. So for something to keep your eyes on, I think one of the potential results of this voting and this so-called election event is that the prime minister could be shifted out of office. Mikhail Mishustin is the prime minister currently, and he hasn't done anything wrong. He's, by all accounts, a very effective technocrat. And in fact, he's not particularly charismatic. He doesn't have a lot of ambition, but he doesn't seem to want to follow in Putin's footsteps either. And so for that reason and a few others, we could see him replaced. And this is significant because the prime minister is the head of government and would be the successor to the president if the president were to die in office. So we do want to know who the prime minister is. And I guess one of the other reasons that he could be pushed out is because Putin has been talking a lot lately about veteran status and saying things like the elites in this country should have a connection to the military. They should have veteran status, or they should have military experience. They should be in the military. And so that doesn't quite describe Mishustin. So that's another reason why he could be pushed out. So you'll want to just keep your ear open for his name. And one final point, if we go to the next slide. This is a picture of an 11th grade textbook that was put into circulation starting last September. And it talks about the US election. And I wanted to put this up to talk about how the Russian election and the thinking that is surrounding the Russian event is tightly linked to the US 2024 election. So even in textbooks for schools, this is being discussed. And I think that the Kremlin is waiting to see what happens with our election, and is likely hoping that Western fatigue over the war in Ukraine will translate into policies that will weaken NATO's position. Let's go to the next and final slide, please. So I'll just say that Vladimir Putin has dominated the political scene since 2000. And this victory that he's just experienced will allow him to remain president until 2030. After that, he can run one more time and serve for another 6 years. So he'll serve until 2036 for 6 years, and then he can stand again for another election in 2036, by which time he'll be 83 years old. So I will stop there. I can see the questions are coming in, so let's take some.
All right, first, thanks for the presentation. It was good. I did, when you talked about, some of the provinces or locations in Ukraine, stories of folks being held at gunpoint to vote. I did notice while I was doing some research for the show notes here that of all the locations that I saw, all of the ones in Ukraine were above 90% for Putin. And the only place that was higher that was not Ukrainian was Chechnya. Was the only one that was, and I think it was the highest at like 98% voted for Putin. My question before we get to the ones in the chat was, why did Putin run as an independent as opposed to attached to a party?
Oh, that's a really good question. He abandoned his party a few years back. So he's been an independent for a few years now. And I honestly, I'm not sure if it's just because he wants to distance himself from others or if there was a problem in the party. I'm not 100% sure about that. That's a good question, though.
Got it. So we'll go to the chat for the next one. So the very first one is from Mr. James Harvey, who first says, thank you. And then he says, do you know if Western election observers were allowed?
As far as I know, I don't think there were any election observers of any nationality allowed. Certainly not Western. OSCE, for example, was not invited in.
Gotcha. And then from Don Hahn, he says, in many ways, I think it's difficult for Westerners to fathom the way Russians think. You mentioned that one of Putin's objectives was to show that he had the mandate to lead. So he asks, is that similar to China's mandate of heaven, where the right to lead is associated with a divine right? And the second question is such a campaign actually effective with the Russian population and internationally?
Well, no, I don't think that we can equate the mandate that I was speaking about to the Chinese mandate of heaven, which I have a passing familiarity with. I think that that's closer to, as you say, a divine right. This is an idea that, and it links to your second question, tightly, that Putin wants to be able to present himself as the legitimate leader of the Russian people. And the numbers give him the ability to, as I was saying, to say, they're with me. They're behind me. I've got their best interest at heart. I am the elected, duly elected leader of this society. Whether that's true or not, because there's no transparency, so we don't know what the actual vote numbers were. But so why, and then I think your question is basically, why do they bother? Let's see, does that work with the effective with the Russian population internationally? I think it might be somewhat effective with the Russian population who have, limited access to international news and resources, but I'm not so sure how effective it is on the international scene. But it certainly allows him a certain rhetoric. He allows him a rhetorical stance.
Gotcha. And Ian's got the next question. I think it kind of feeds into a quick conversation we had before we started the podcast here. But Ian asks, what second order effects might there be on Putin's hold on power following the terrorist attack at the theater last week? And then he did bring up kind of in addition to the question, saying how closely it seemed to follow Putin's re-election victory.
Right. So I don't know if the timing was intentional or if it was opportunistic, but the discussions now are amplifying discussions that were taking place before the terrorist attack. So one thing is, will Putin enact another mobilization? Will he call up new recruits, new conscripts to the for the war in Ukraine? The people of Russia are pretty much against that, and I jotted down some numbers. There's a brand new article in Foreign Affairs that came out today. It's very good, where they did some polling. And about 25% of people in Russia seem to oppose the war. About 20 to 25% are for the war. And about 54% say it should continue. But that's an ambiguous advocacy for continuity. I mean, I think there's probably even more apathy than there is ambivalence. So you've got about 50% of the population that is kind of on the fence. So will he call up new recruits? Will he call up new conscripts is a big question. And then will he crack down tougher at home because of the because he's got this mandate, or because of the terrorist attack, which requires him to now flex his muscle and show his strength. One thing I can say that is happening as a second order effect is that the people who are living in Russia, who are migrants from Central Asia, are really getting beat up on, literally beat up on. They're being targeted, and that's because the people who were found initially to be involved with the terrorist attack are from Tajikistan, which is in Central Asia. And so the identity being known as Tajik puts the rest of the Tajiks in the crosshairs. So you have about 1 million or so Tajik citizens from Tajikistan working as migrant workers in Russia every year, and they're under attack. So it's kind of a second or third order effect happening there.
Yeah, and Ian follows up a little bit saying, he wasn't necessarily trying to imply that Putin necessarily had a hand in the attack, but it seems that the close proximity to the election would seem to strongly undermine the idea that Putin is a competent defender of Russia's securities, which I feel like you touched on a little bit by, possibly using it as an excuse for more call-ups.
Right. Yeah, and I don't think there's any. I mean, I know what he's referring to. There were the apartment bombings in 1999 that took place that are largely thought to have been orchestrated by representatives or people within the security services. So it was a false flag kind of situation. Nobody has said that they think that that's the case here, especially since ISIS-K has taken responsibility. So everything I've seen so far points to a belief that it was in fact ISIS-K that carried it out.
And then Mr. James Harvey has the next one. He says, there have been reports of villages losing nearly all of their military-aged males. I would think the anti-war sentiment in such villages would be strong. Do you know if there are any anti-Putin protests outside of Russia's major cities?
I think that there were, I wouldn't call them protests because I think it's just become so dangerous to protest. Well, let me back up. So as far as the election day goes, people were taking part quietly, as I said, either with smart voting or with the protest against Putin showing up at noon, which was, on the face of it, not an illegal act, just showing up to vote. And that took place around the country. There were maybe 3 months ago, there were protests in Bashkortostan, which is another Turkic Muslim majority area outside of Moscow, similar to the Republic of Tatarstan. It's a place that non-Russians live, and they had protests, serious protests that required the security services to come out and quell them over a few days due to the arrest of a popular activist. He was arrested, and it wasn't, I don't even think he was protesting the war, but he got swept up in for protesting environmental issues. And because he was arrested, that triggered protests among the people. So, yeah.
So the next question comes from Albert Lee, and he asks, to what extent did the mainstream Russian media cover or attempt to block out things like the Volgograd incursions or the Ukrainian refinery campaign, he says, for the lack of a better term, in the run-up to the voting days? And I think you touched on it a little bit with how much the Russian people are getting in terms of international news.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure how they treated or handled those particular events in the local news. Certainly, I'm looking more at opposition news in recent days, but I think that they are trying to, on one hand, the government is trying to suppress news of negative things coming out of that result from the war in Ukraine. But at the same time, the Belgorod incursions, one thing they did was they moved a lot of the children out of there, because it's in the west of Russia. It's on the border with Ukraine, and so it's been under attack. So they moved the children out of there, and I don't think they I don't think they kept that secret, because it works with it works well with the Kremlin's ideas that this is a defensive. We're fighting a defensive war here. See, we're under attack too.
Great, thanks. So it looks like the questions have mostly stopped for a little bit. Albert did post a link saying that there were some Italian election observers, and he links to a tweet, but it seems like they were sympathetic or credulous to the Russian narrative.
Okay.
But he did bring up, and I think you kind of touched on this a little bit at the very beginning when you were talking about the elections themselves, being a ritual. And Dr. Good, who's post he linked, makes the argument that the Russian elections are a ritual, much like the Victory Day parades.
Yes. So again, I think it goes back to what we were talking about with Don about this mandate, that it was a confidence builder for Putin, and it allows him to then say, to puff up his chest and say, I am the leader, I'm duly elected, even though it's a charade, and I don't see how they can know in their heart of hearts that we know that this is a charade, but it gives him that rhetorical position, as I was saying, to say that he's a duly elected leader.
Yeah, it seems like the plot to a parody movie coming out of Hollywood to make fun of everything. So we're closing in on the end of our hour, so I did want to kick it over to you for any closing comments you might have.
Well, the only closing comments that I guess I wanted to say was going back to the situation with the Tajiks in Russia. I think it's gonna be interesting to watch what happens between Russia and Central Asia over the next several months, because you do have migrant workers from Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan who regularly go to Russia for work. And Tajikistan is the most remittance reliance country in the world, as far as we know. And their government is doing very little to create jobs at home. So how they're going to facilitate this continued flow of workers to Russia, whether they're going to stop it, whether it's going to just become too dangerous for them in Russia moving forward, is something to look out for.
Great, thank you. Dr. Clement, thank you for your time and your insight. And thank you to all the folks who joined us today in the chat. That's all we have for this episode, so go ahead and carry out the plan of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you have enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.